63 candidates stood in the glass lobby of the Aegis Corps building, shoulders broad backs, straight, each dressed in black suits, as if they had belonged there long before they walked in. Then the revolving door shifted softly, and Marcus Reed stepped inside. Following him was a 6-year-old girl, with her hair neatly tied, clutching a white stuffed rabbit worn thin at the ears. His shirt was not ironed flat. His shoes were clean, but not new. Laughter appeared almost immediately. Someone said it looked more like a school drop-off than a selection process. Another leaned back in his chair, looking more closely, as if to make sure he wasn't mistaken. Marcus did not turn back. He bent down, seated his daughter on a nearby chair, his hand resting on her hair for a brief moment, then stood up and walked toward the evaluation area. 30 seconds later, Darius King, a fighter weighing over 110 kilograms who had already finished 3 matches earlier that morning, lay face down on the mat. No one laughed anymore. Even Vanessa Cole, who had stood close enough to catch every smallest movement, did not take her eyes off the man who had just stepped down from the mat, while her heartbeat, though she would never admit it aloud, no longer held its previous steady rhythm. The man they had just mocked would become the only one standing between her and everything she was about to lose. Before we continue following the journey of Marcus Reed, if you also believe that a person's true worth is not defined by appearance or hasty first judgments, but by their strength, composure, and what they do when no one believes in them anymore, then please like and subscribe to the channel. Together, let's share meaningful and profound stories like this with even more people. That Monday morning, the Aegis Corps building stood quietly under the early sunlight, its blue-tinted glass reflecting the sky into cold, even panels of light. In the eastern part of the city, where major tech companies chose to place their headquarters, everything usually operated on its own distinct rhythm, precise, quiet, and somewhat distant. But the ground floor of the building that day carried a different atmosphere. The main lobby had been completely cleared. Rows of chairs were arranged into 2 long lines facing each other, forming an empty space in between, like a silent stage. 63 men stood or sat there, each dressed neatly in black suits, polished shoes, ties perfectly aligned. They did not speak loudly, but their presence alone was enough to fill the room. These were men accustomed to being chosen, former police officers, former soldiers, people who had worked in environments where danger was not a concept, but a daily reality. They stood with a strikingly similar posture, shoulders open, chins, slightly raised eyes scanning the surroundings, with a confidence that felt almost automatic. The air carried the faint scent of cologne and new leather. At the front near the reception area, a tall man with neatly trimmed hair leaned casually against the desk, speaking with the staff. It was Ryan Blake, the current head of security. He did not need an introduction, as most of the people in the room already knew who he was. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly enough for those nearby to hear. A few of his remarks drew quiet laughter. The selection process had not officially begun, but nearly everyone had already imagined the outcome. Then the glass revolving door at the entrance shifted slightly. At first, not many noticed. It was just a small movement at the edge of vision. But then one glance turned into another, and within seconds attention spread in a very natural way. The man who walked in did not look like the rest of the room. He wore a simple, light-colored shirt, slightly wrinkled at the cuffs, as if it had been worn many times without much concern for keeping it pressed. Dark trousers not tailored in any elaborate way. His shoes were clean, but not new. Notier, no file in hand, and behind him, lightly holding on to the hem of his shirt, was a small girl, about 6 years old, her hair neatly tied back. In her arms she held a white stuffed rabbit, its ears slightly flattened from being handled too often. The girl said nothing. She simply looked around, her eyes, observing quietly and carefully, as if committing every detail to memory. A very brief pause settled over the room. Then someone let out a soft laugh. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to break the silence that had just formed. "Looks more like a school drop-off than an interview." A voice came from the front row. A few others smiled. Not openly malicious, but not bothering to hide it either. The man Marcus Reed did not turn around. He stopped near the reception area and bent down to the girl's level. The space between them narrowed into something private, separate from the rest of the room. "Sit here for a bit," he said, his voice low and even. The girl nodded, asking nothing more. He pulled a nearby chair out, placed the stuffed rabbit in front, then helped her sit down. His hand lingered for a second, on her hair, brushing it gently like a habit ingrained into every movement. There was no rush, no awkwardness, just something that needed to be done and done properly. When he straightened up, his gaze swept across the room, once not lingering on anyone for too long. Then he walked toward the main area where the candidates were waiting. Ryan Blake stepped away from the reception desk and approached him. The distance between them was set quickly in the way people used to. Measuring strength often did close enough to apply pressure far enough to avoid contact. "This place isn't for families," Ryan said, his tone light, almost polite, if not for the way his eyes flicked down toward the stuffed animal still in the girl's hands behind him. "If you're looking for daycare, it's downstairs." A few quiet laughs followed, clearer this time. Marcus looked straight at Ryan. His expression did not change. No sign of irritation. No defensive reaction. Just the calm presence of someone accustomed to being looked at this way, and no longer feeling the need to explain. "I have an appointment at 9, he said. "My name is on the list." Ryan took the tablet from the staff member beside him. His finger scrolled quickly through the list. A glance, then a pause. For a very brief moment, something tightened across his face. Marcus Reed. That name was at the very top, and it had been added late with an internal note, not fully visible, only a confirmation mark from the highest level. Ryan handed the tablet back without comment. His chin tilted slightly toward the hallway leading to the evaluation area. "Inside room," he said. Marcus gave a slight nod, as if that was only natural. He turned to look at his daughter one more time. The girl had already opened a coloring book, her crayon moving slowly across the page, completely absorbed in her own task. He stepped into the hallway. Behind him, the laughter had quieted. Not because people had changed their minds, but because there was something in the way he walked that made them no longer certain what they were looking at. The selection had not officially begun, but the atmosphere in the room had already changed. The evaluation area was located behind the main lobby, separated by a long corridor, lit with evenly spaced white lights, not too bright, but enough to make every detail visible in a way that felt slightly uncomfortable. The floor was polished to the point of reflecting every step, and even the smallest sounds. A shoe touching the ground, a light brush against the wall were amplified more than necessary, as if the space had been designed to make people acutely aware that they were being observed. Marcus Reed walked into it without changing his pace. He neither sped up nor slowed down. There was no adjustment to match where he was entering, no effort to blend in with those around him, and in a very subtle way that made him stand out more than any display others might attempt. The other candidates stood in small clusters near the evaluation tables, each maintaining just enough distance from the next person, not close enough to feel familiar, but not far enough to appear isolated. They spoke in short sentences, often beginning with familiar phrases like "I used to," or "in my previous assignment," and ending with knowing nods that only those in the same field could share. Marcus joined none of those groups. He stood alone, not because there was nowhere to stand, but because he was not looking for a place. When his name was called, the interviewer did not look up immediately. She was a middle-aged woman, her hair neatly tied back, glasses resting low on her nose, her eyes accustomed to reading quickly and judging just as quickly. She had gone through dozens of files that morning, each carefully prepared, clearly presented, and often accompanied by explanations longer than necessary. When Marcus placed his paper on the table, she paused, not out of shock, but because of the absence of everything she was used to seeing. A blank sheet of paper, a phone number, a single short line. No unit name, no rank, no achievements, just a request for verification. She looked up. Her expression showed no irritation, but it did not hide her doubt either. "Do you understand what this position is?" She asked, her voice even neither confrontational nor friendly. Marcus stood straight. His arms rested naturally at his sides, not on the table, not crossed, not forming any posture that could be read as defensive or aggressive. "I do," he said. A brief pause followed. The woman glanced at the paper again, as if searching for something she might have missed. Nothing else appeared. A few steps behind Ryan, Blake stood with his arms crossed. He did not participate directly in the interview, but his presence was close enough for every answer to be heard clearly. "You didn't bring a file." Ryan said, his voice low, almost more an observation than a question. "Nothing to prove your experience?" Marcus did not turn. He did not look at Ryan when he responded. "If proof is needed, that number will do it," he said. Ryan exhaled softly through his nose, a short sound, like someone trying to remain patient with something he had already decided was not worth arguing over. He said nothing more, but his gaze lingered on the paper longer than usual, as if trying to determine whether this was confidence or ignorance. The next phase of the evaluation began immediately after, without any clear transition, as if the entire process had been designed to eliminate those who needed time to prepare. A large screen lit up, and a simulated scenario appeared, a crowded environment overlapping movements, a central figure placed in what seemed like a safe context, but actually contained multiple blind spots. The candidates stood in line, each called up in turn. They watched the video, then gave their assessments. Some spoke quickly, as if speed could compensate for accuracy. Others spoke more slowly, choosing their words carefully, trying to demonstrate depth in their analysis. When it was Marcus's turn, the room had settled into a familiar rhythm watch. Answer, nod, move to the next person. He stood before the screen, his hands still in the same position. He did not take notes. He did not ask to replay the video. He watched it once. There was no visible expression on his face as he observed, no shift in his eyes that others could read. But there was something else. A stillness in the way he looked, as if he wasn't tracking individual movements, but processing the entire scene as a single system. When the video ended, the interviewer looked at him. "What do you see?" she asked. Marcus did not answer immediately. Not because he was thinking, but because he was not in a hurry. "There are 6 marked risk points," he said, his voice even without emphasis, "and 2 unmarked ones." A few glances in the room shifted toward him. Not because the answer was overly impressive, but because it did not fit the pattern they had seen from the others. "Go on," the interviewer said. Marcus tilted his head slightly toward the screen, as if confirming a detail already stored in memory. "Behind the column on the left, there's an area not fully covered by the cameras," he said. "The distance is enough for someone to approach without being recorded for 4 seconds. And the man in the blue coat, his right hand changed position 3 times in 90 seconds. That's not a natural movement." The room fell silent for a brief moment, not long enough to become uncomfortable, but enough to disrupt the rhythm. Ryan Blake stood behind his eyes, narrowing slightly, not out of surprise, but because he was recalibrating his assessment, though not yet ready to admit it. "Just guessing," he said. Marcus did not respond. He stepped down from his position, returning to where he had been standing without looking at anyone. Outside in the reception area, Nia still sat at the low table, her coloring book open in front of her. She had moved on to a new page. The colors were chosen carefully, not by rules, but by a logic only she understood. The stuffed rabbit sat neatly beside her like a silent observer. A young staff member standing nearby occasionally glanced into the hallway, then back at the girl, as if trying to connect 2 images that didn't quite match a tense space filled with competing men and a child drawing in absolute quiet. "Is your dad taking a test?" she asked softly. Nia did not look up immediately. She finished a stroke, then answered, "Yes. Is he good?" The question was gentle, not challenging, just natural curiosity. Nia paused her crayon for a second. "My dad doesn't lose," she said. She said nothing more. And in a way that answer left no room for another question. When the pairing board for the physical evaluation round was posted, it didn't create immediate noise, but spread slowly, like a small ripple across a surface already stretched tight. Those closest to the board read first, their eyes moving quickly, then lingering longer on certain names, and it only took one person's expression to shift, however slightly, for the others to start paying attention. No one spoke loudly, but the silences between groups grew heavier, and the room's attention gradually converged on a single point. Marcus Reed, Darius King. The two names faced each other, placed side by side in a way too deliberate to be called random, yet too reasonable to openly object to. Darius read the list the corner of his mouth, lifting slightly. Not a mocking smile, but a quiet confirmation of what he had assumed from the beginning, that the morning would end the way it was supposed to. Across the room, Ryan Blake stood at a distance just far enough to avoid appearing, as if he were double-checking his own decision, yet close enough to observe the reactions of others. His gaze didn't linger on anyone for long, but when it passed over Marcus, there was a faint trace of attention, almost imperceptible, like someone who had just placed a chess piece and was waiting to see how it would move on a board he believed he controlled. Marcus did not approach the board immediately. He remained where he was, not separating himself from the space, but not joining the flow of people moving forward either. When he finally stepped closer, his eyes scanned the list, once not pausing on his own name, longer than a normal beat, and there was no sign that he was calculating or adjusting anything in his mind. He read, he understood, and then he left. No reaction, no question. Outside near the reception area, Nia had left the drawing table and was standing near a small glass panel overlooking the training area. She didn't climb onto a chair, didn't try to push closer. She simply stood there, holding her stuffed rabbit with both hands, her gaze fixed inside with a quiet but unmistakable focus. The staff member beside her followed her line of sight for a moment, then looked down at the girl as if trying to understand what allowed a child to stand so still for so long, without needing to be told. "Do you want to sit?" she asked. Nia shook her head slightly. She said nothing more. In the training area, the large mat had been cleared. The lighting here was different from the corridor, softer, but no less precise. The remaining candidates formed a wide circle around it, their distance naturally maintained without instruction. A few took out their phones, not because they were certain something worth recording would happen, but because they were used to capturing moments that might confirm what they believed would occur. Darius stepped onto the mat first. He moved with the confidence of someone who didn't need to check his body before using it. His shoulders rolled slightly, his neck tilted to one side, a sequence of familiar motions performed not to prepare, but to remind himself that he had done this many times before. Marcus appeared at the edge of the mat a few seconds later. He didn't step on immediately. He paused, bent down, and retied the lace of his left shoe. The motion was unhurried, not drawn out beyond necessity, but not shortened to accommodate the attention now focused on him. It happened exactly the way someone would tie their shoe when no one was watching. When he stood up, he didn't look at Darius. He didn't look at the crowd. He stepped onto the mat with the calm of someone who had accepted the outcome of what was about to happen, not because he knew what it would be, but because he didn't need to know in advance to continue. Darius looked down at him. The distance between them wasn't large, but it was enough for the difference in size to be obvious. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering something that didn't truly require consideration. "You can step out," Darius said, his voice not loud but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "No one will hold your place if you don't want to." A few small laughs surfaced, then quickly faded, as if no one had decided whether this was still a joke. Marcus did not respond. He stood in position, feet set at the correct distance, his center of gravity lowered naturally, not a clearly defined fighting stance, but a readiness that didn't need to present itself. Near the door, Nia shifted one small step to see more clearly through the narrow glass frame. She didn't call out, didn't wave. Her attention remained entirely on the man on the mat, and in some way that created a still point in the space that was steadily tightening. The signal to begin was given. Darius moved first. No hesitation, no probing motion. He closed the distance at a speed he had used in many previous matches, a sequence repeated often enough to become reflex. Marcus stepped back once. Not a large step, not an obvious evasion, just a small adjustment of foot placement, a shift of weight toward the outer edge of his left foot, enough to alter Darius's angle of approach by a fraction almost imperceptible, unless someone was looking for it. Darius's hand closed. There was nothing there. A very small gap, but enough. He adjusted, immediately turned and moved in again, this time slightly faster, slightly more decisive, as if correcting a technical error. Marcus moved again. No more than before. No faster. Just on time. In the first 10 seconds, no real strike occurred. Only approaches that didn't connect. Only distances opening and closing in a way no one in the room could immediately explain. Above, in the observation area, Vanessa Cole stood by the glass, her hand resting lightly on the metal frame, her gaze fixed on the two men below. She had watched many evaluations before, seen many kinds of confrontations, and usually needed only a few seconds to categorize what she was looking at. But this time she did not categorize. She observed. At the 15th second, there was a very small change, not in the body's movement, but in Marcus's eyes, a slight contraction nearly impossible to notice without complete focus. Not a reaction, not hesitation, a conclusion. He stepped forward. No more retreat. The distance between them collapsed in one short, precise motion so clean that most of those watching didn't realize anything had changed until it already had. One of Marcus's hands touched Darius's elbow. The other made a subtle adjustment at the upper body. No great force, no wide motion, just a rearrangement. And in that rearrangement, Darius's weight was no longer where he thought it was. His body lost its base and went down. There was no loud impact, just a short, dry sound as a heavy body hit the mat. Then silence. Marcus released his grip, stepped back once. His breathing did not change. He looked down for a moment, not to check his opponent, but as part of a completed sequence of actions. Then he turned away. At the door, Nia was no longer looking through the glass. She was already inside the room no one had noticed when she stepped in. "Are you done, Dad?" she asked. Marcus bent down to her level. "I'm done," he said. She nodded, as if that were the only possible answer. They stood up at the same time and left the mat. Behind them, the room had not yet found its voice again. The silence after Darius King hit the mat did not end immediately, but stretched out slowly, as if the room needed more time to adjust to what it had just witnessed. No one applauded. No one commented. Phones were still raised, but no one remembered to lower them. A few people glanced at each other, then back at the mat, as if waiting for some signal to confirm that everything had truly ended. Marcus Reed had already left the area before the silence could dissolve. He bent down and said something to his daughter that no one could hear, then took her hand and walked toward the corridor where the white light became even and familiar again. The girl walked beside him, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, not looking back, not asking anything further, as if what had just happened was entirely within her understanding. Behind them, Darius was helped to his feet. He wasn't seriously injured, but there was a slight delay in his movements, a small gap between intention and action, as if his body was still trying to recover an order it had just lost. He said nothing, did not look toward Marcus. And to those accustomed to reading people, that meant more than any reaction could have. Ryan Blake stood near the edge of the mat, his gaze still fixed on the corridor Marcus had just passed through. The list in his hand had slipped slightly, the edge brushing the floor with a faint sound he didn't seem to notice. When he finally bent down to pick it up, there was a delay in his movement, just a fraction of a second he had never shown before. Upstairs in the northeast corner office, Vanessa Cole was no longer seated. She stood near her desk, one hand resting lightly on its surface, her eyes still fixed on the screen, displaying the evaluation room below. For over 10 minutes, she had not written anything further in the notebook lying on the desk. The pen remained exactly where it was, as if forgotten, in the middle of a sequence of observations she did not want to interrupt. Madeline Ross, her assistant, stood near the door, maintaining just enough distance not to disturb the concentration in the room. She had been watching the same screen, though not with the same perspective. "He's not like the others," she said quietly, choosing her words carefully, as if unsure whether what she had noticed was precise enough to say aloud. Vanessa did not respond immediately. She continued watching the screen for a few more seconds, then turned back. Her gaze was no longer observational. It had shifted into decision. "No," she said, "he isn't." The pause after that statement wasn't long, but it was enough to confirm she had reached a conclusion without needing further proof. "Call him up," she said. Madeline nodded, asked nothing more, and left the room with a step slightly faster than usual, yet still carrying the quiet restraint expected on this floor, where every sound tended to be controlled. Down on the first floor, the candidates were still waiting for the next round's results. Some had begun talking again, but their voices were lower than before, and stories of experience or achievements were no longer told with the same certainty. What had just happened wasn't mentioned directly, but it was present in the way they stood, the way they looked toward the door, and the way they paused before making any judgment. When Madeline appeared at the entrance, attention shifted again. She carried no list. She did not call names in order. She simply scanned the room, once then stopped at Marcus, who was standing near the corridor with his daughter beside him, as if he had already known he wouldn't need to return to the main area. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice clear but not loud. "Miss Cole would like to see you." A few glances moved quickly between Marcus and Madeline, then turned toward Ryan Blake, as if expecting an official reaction. Ryan straightened, adjusted his cuff slightly, his mouth opening as if about to say something, perhaps an explanation or a procedural correction. But Madeline had already turned away before he could begin. Marcus did not ask why. He did not look around to confirm anything. He simply gave a slight nod, then took his daughter's hand and followed her. The corridor leading to the elevator was long and quiet, the lights reflecting off the metal doors in uninterrupted lines. When the doors opened, no one was inside. No music, just an enclosed space where every small movement became more noticeable. Nia stepped in, first, looked up at the control panel, then at Madeline. "Are we going high?" she asked. Madeline smiled faintly, a smile less formal than the ones she usually wore at work. "Very high," she said. The elevator moved, not fast enough to feel abrupt, but enough to create a slight pressure in the ears, a physical sign that they were leaving the rest of the building behind. Marcus stood still, his gaze forward, not looking at the rising numbers, not at his reflection in the metal doors. When the doors opened on the 38th floor, the space beyond was entirely different. The sound was softer here. The floor was carpeted thickly, the lighting adjusted to eliminate glare. No one walked by, no voices carried. Everything was maintained at a level just sufficient not to disturb the thoughts of those who worked here. Vanessa Cole's office stood at the far end of the corridor, its door not fully closed. When they entered, the space opened into wide glass panels overlooking the city, distant buildings broken into clean geometric shapes under the late morning light. Her desk was arranged with near absolute minimalism. A screen, a notebook, a glass of water. No personal photos, no decorations. Nia paused near the door, looking around, her gaze moving slowly, as if evaluating the space by her own standards. "It's nice," she said after a moment, "but there are no plants." Vanessa looked at the girl, not with surprise, but with clear attention, as if the comment had touched on a detail she had never considered. "I know," she said. Then she turned her gaze to Marcus. "Sit," she said. Marcus sat down. He did not adjust his position, did not move the chair closer or farther. He sat as if it had already been placed correctly. Nia sat beside him, opened her small notebook, and began drawing without being asked, without looking up. Vanessa placed a thin file on the table and slid it gently toward Marcus. She did not begin with a greeting, nor did she ask the usual questions. "Where did you learn that technique?" she asked. Marcus looked at the file for a second, then back at her. "In specific environments," he said. "What kind of environments?" A pause. "Places without second chances," he said. Vanessa observed him, not the answer, but the way he gave it without defensiveness, without elaboration, and without leaving room for misinterpretation. "And your file?" she asked. "The person who sent it to me." Marcus looked down at the document again, this time a little longer. There was a slight movement behind his eyes, not emotion, but recognition, as if a piece had just fallen into place. "I don't know," he said. Vanessa held his gaze for one more beat. She believed him. And that was precisely what made everything more complicated. The first week of Marcus Reed at Aegis Corps did not create any obvious changes in how the building operated, and that in itself was the first thing that made Vanessa Cole realize something had changed. There were no abnormal reports, no security incidents recorded. No one on Ryan Blake's team was replaced or reprimanded. Everything on the surface continued, according to the established procedures. But in the small details, in the pauses between familiar actions, there was a subtle adjustment that only those who had lived within that system long enough could sense. Marcus did not walk beside Vanessa, nor did he walk ahead. He maintained a position exactly one step behind her, not two, not half a step, but a distance held with near-perfect precision, regardless of whether the corridor was wide or narrow, regardless of how their pace changed. At first, Vanessa thought it was simply a habit formed through training. But by the third day, when she realized that the distance was never broken, even when she stopped abruptly or changed direction without warning, she understood it was not a habit. It was a choice. He did not observe her the way others did. No constant checking glances, no posture adjustments when she turned, no signs of attending to a superior. Instead, his attention was distributed evenly throughout the surrounding space, drifting lightly across corners, doorways, passing individuals, and only returning to her when something in the environment changed. Not because she was the center, but because she was the responsibility. The difference was small in behavior, but clear in perception. And for Vanessa, who was used to being the point of reference in every room, she entered the absence of that created a gap that took her several days to name. On the second floor in the security room, screens displayed footage from every corner of the building arranged according to a logic only the system's operators could read quickly. Marcus sat at one of the consoles at the end of each day, not because it was assigned, but because it was something he added to his own process. He reviewed footage not in chronological order, but based on points he had already marked in his mind, small moments the rest of the system did not consider noteworthy. On the fourth day, he paused at a log. It wasn't an event. There was no alert, no error signal, just an absence. 11 minutes in the basement camera system, no footage, no note, no indication that the system had gone offline, and no valid reason to explain the gap. In a system built with multiple redundancies, where each camera had at least 2 parallel recording sources, losing data without a trace was not an error. It was an action. Marcus did not report it immediately. He did not call Ryan, did not send an email, did not create a ticket in the system. He copied the log, then closed it. He sat there for a while longer, the light from the monitors reflecting on his face, not casting sharp shadows, but enough to emphasize the stillness in the way he processed information. Those who had worked in environments where threats did not come from the outside, but from within the structure itself would recognize it. The way he did not rush, did not react by procedure, but instead began constructing another map, a layer of understanding not officially recorded. On the 38th floor, Vanessa received an email at the end of the 5th day. No sender name, no signature, only a single sentence. "You are being sold without knowing it." She read it once. Then again. Not because it was hard to understand, but because of the way it was written, not threatening, not trying to provoke fear, but like a statement from someone who didn't need to persuade. The attachment was a screenshot of a clause in the partnership contract with Hale Dynamics, a document she had signed 6 months earlier in a process that at the time had seemed entirely reasonable. The clause was marked as a subsection inconspicuous, buried between technical and legal descriptions. Vanessa called her legal team. No one answered. 40 minutes later, her lead lawyer's assistant called back, the voice maintained at a professional level, but with an over-smoothness in the explanation, as if every sentence had been prepared in advance. She listened, did not interrupt. But when the call ended, she did not return to work immediately. She sat there looking out through the glass at the city, the afternoon light beginning to shift buildings, turning from blue to gray, then to pale gold. Marcus stood near the window at the same distance as always. "Do you know anything about this?" she asked. He did not answer immediately, not because he didn't have one, but because he was choosing how to say it. "Not enough," he said, "but I'm looking." Vanessa turned to look at him. There was a small difference in the way he stood, his shoulders slightly tenser. His jaw subtly set a sign she had begun to recognize over the past few days. Even when he showed no emotion, his body still held a trace of it. "Why are you reading my contracts?" she asked, no accusation in her voice, just a question that needed to be asked. Marcus looked out the glass for a second, then back at her. "I can't protect you if I don't understand the ground you're standing on," he said. The answer was not an explanation. It was a principle. On the second floor in the security room, Marcus reopened the 11-minute log. He zoomed in on each time segment, cross-referencing with other sensor data motion heat access cards. Nothing aligned perfectly, and it was that misalignment that formed a shape, blurred, incomplete, but enough to recognize it wasn't random. He opened the system access logs. The name Ryan Blake appeared within that time frame. Not proof, but a starting point. Marcus did not flag it in the main system. He created a separate record, one no one else knew about. On the 38th floor, Vanessa still sat at her desk, the screen before her displaying the highlighted clause again. She read it a third time, slower this time, word by word, missing nothing, as if she were reading an entirely new document. In the silence of the office, where no sound existed beyond the hum of the air system and the faint movements of the city below, something began to form, not certainty, but awareness. That what she had signed might not be what she had understood. The shareholder meeting began in a space so controlled that there was almost no room left for unpredictability. Natural light poured through the large eastern glass panels, reflecting across the long, dark wooden table where every chair had been positioned hours in advance, every glass filled to the same level, and every document arranged in precise order without needing to be checked again, because on the 38th floor of Aegis Core, precision was not a requirement, but a default. Vanessa Cole sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the surface. Her gaze did not linger on any one person too long, yet missed no movement in the room. Behind her, Marcus Reed held his familiar position, one step, no more, no less a distance. Not marked on any diagram, yet more precise than any official protocol the security team had ever followed. He did not watch those speaking in turn. He did not follow the charts on the screen. Nor did he observe Vanessa the way others did when standing near power. Instead, his attention moved slowly across points outside the center, the side door at the end of the corridor, the intersection between two emergency exits, the rhythm of staff bringing in water and leaving, and more importantly, the gaps between those movements where nothing happened, but where more information existed than in any visible action. The shift in rhythm did not appear as an event, but as a sensation. A slight misalignment between what he saw and how he knew the system should function. A deviation most would overlook. But to him, it was not a detail. It was a signal. He left his position without drawing attention. Moving past the back row of chairs, through the meeting room door, and into the eastern corridor at the same steady pace he had maintained since morning, not faster, not slower, but with a focus that had changed. No longer dispersed across the space, it had converged on a point he had identified before stepping out. The corridor leading to the server area was quieter than the rest of the floor. The lighting was dimmer not to save energy, but to reduce visual interference in a high-precision environment. The temperature was kept at a level immediately noticeable to the human body if unaccustomed a dry, stable cold. The server room door was not in the state it should have been. Not open, not broken, just unlocked. A small deviation. Enough! Marcus did not pause to confirm it in the usual way, because he did not need additional evidence once the elements aligned with the pattern forming in his mind. When he pushed the door and stepped inside, the scene matched his expectation. 4 individuals not rushed, not uneasy, moving with the precision of those who had been prepared and believed they were operating within a window no one else had the authority to enter. They did not see him immediately, and that changed the entire equation. What followed could not be separated into individual actions without losing its essence, because it was not a sequence of techniques, but a process of removing the opponent's options in a predetermined order where each movement was not meant to win, but to end, and each closing distance was not for attack, but to render response impossible. The first lost the ability to act before his internal alarm completed. The second turned at an angle Marcus had already anticipated the moment he crossed the threshold. The third reacted faster, but moved along a trajectory that had been predicted. And the fourth, the one who maintained balance the longest, became undone by his own force, not by greater strength, but by a precise adjustment at exactly the right point. 11 seconds passed without any sound loud enough to carry into the hallway, only a change of state within the room. When Marcus straightened, he did not look at those who had fallen, but at the system behind them, the ports, the monitors, the running signals, and what had been touched during the time the system failed to record. Footsteps behind him arrived exactly as he turned. Ryan Blake stood in the doorway, his gun held steady, his expression devoid of surprise, devoid of anger, only a cold acceptance of someone who had reached a point where all other possibilities had been eliminated. "I need 15 minutes," Ryan said, his voice even not raised as if proposing something reasonable in a situation he still believed could be controlled. Marcus looked at him, not at the weapon, not at the distance, but at the center of the decision, at the man in front of him, at what he had chosen, and what remained after that choice. "I don't have 15 minutes, he said. There was no threat in his voice, no opposition, only a clearly defined reality. The distance between them did not change much, but its meaning had. From that moment, one was still calculating while the other had already finished calculating. And in that difference, the outcome had been decided before the first movement occurred. When the security team arrived, they did not step into an ongoing situation, but into a completed state where Ryan Blake sat against the wall, both hands no longer usable, his gaze not searching for solutions, but resting in a void he could not cross. Upstairs, Vanessa Cole listened to Victor Hale's entire presentation without interruption, without changing expression. Only when he finished did she place her hand on the table, shift her gaze from the document to him, and speak in a voice no louder than before, yet impossible to misinterpret. "This meeting will be adjourned, and the clause you just referenced will be reviewed under conditions of partner fraud," she said. The silence that followed was not a lack of reaction, but a collective realization that the balance in the room had shifted. Night came slowly at the hospital. The fluorescent lights were not warm enough to be comforting, but sufficient to soften the sharp edges of a long day. In the small room where Marcus sat with his shoulder bandaged, his arm resting still unmoving beyond necessity, the door opened with a soft motion, and Naya stepped in with the same calm she had carried since morning. She did not run, did not call out. She walked over, placed her hand in his, and held it there, no questions, no need for answers. for her presence was enough. Vanessa stood behind, watching the scene not with observation, but with involvement. And when Naya turned and asked if she could stay, Vanessa did not look to Marcus for permission. She looked instead into the space between them, where a decision had already been made without words. She pulled a chair closer, sat down, and in that space where a child slept between two adults who did not need to explain their connection, where a stuffed rabbit lay at the center, like a small anchor holding everything in place, there was a change not recorded in any system of Aegis Core. No report, no data, no official trace, yet it remained, and would remain longer than any clause that had ever been signed.